I don't know about you, but I've come to realize that the basketball court is one of the most difficult places to act like a Christian. It can be. A wise man once said, adult church basketball games begin with a prayer, and that's the last Christian act on the court. Actually, that was Ralph Boughton that told me that. So it was not a wise man, but the basketball court is one of the best places to be a Christian. When I was a relatively new young Christian in high school, since I knew I wasn't going to be a minister or a missionary, I tried to find a way that I could be a Christian, and I played basketball all the time. And that's kind of where I tried to be a tool for God and God's kingdom. I came across a t-shirt that kind of summed it all up for me when I was 15 or 16. On the front, it was clearly a basketball t-shirt, but on the back, it said, "Enter God's courts with praise." And it said Psalm 104. I had never read that verse before, so I took the shirt home and looked that verse up, and sure enough, it said, "Enter God's courts with praise." And that was the perfect metaphor for what I wanted to do as a 16-year-old, relatively new Christian who just wanted to make an impact in this world on behalf of God. Things went pretty well, I think. My first sermon ended up being on a basketball court, believe it or not, when I was 16. I had completely forgotten about this, but my mom gave me my scrapbook recently that she had been working on for years and years and years, and I was flipping through it with my kids, and there was a picture of me on a basketball court speaking to about 50 or 60 adults, and I had forgotten that I had been asked on a mission trip to speak midway through a 3-on-3 basketball tournament that a few of my high school friends and I played in. I don't think they asked me to preach a sermon, but I preached a sermon. I also had an armband that I wore whenever I played in basketball games as a high school player, and it was Philippians 4:13. It said, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." It's funny how this one verse, "Enter God's courts with praise," can really influence how you see what you can work with God on in ministry. And this Wednesday, I almost said next week, but this Wednesday will be 20 years since Psalm 100, this passage with the verse about entering God's courts with praise. It will be 20 years since that passage was read at my wedding, right here. That passage was special to me. And even though I'm no longer the recreation director, as I was hired 14 or 15 years ago, I'm still the basketball staff liaison, the staff liaison to church basketball. I'm still trying to figure out what it means to enter God's courts with praise. But what did it mean back in Jesus' day to enter God's courts with praise? And what were the courts? Well, the courts were the areas around the temple. I kind of grew up thinking that the courts were where all the good stuff happened. That's where the worship service happened or whatever, and I always assumed that's where it all happened. But the courts were the surrounding areas. There was the court of the Gentiles, there was the court of the women, there was the court of the men. The closer you got to the center part of the temple, the least access was available to everybody. I think it would be like if our church adopted a similar approach and we took our entire campus, inside, parking lots, fields, everything, and said, anybody can come onto our campus, but you have to be a Christian to walk into our doors. And even further, you have to be a Christian male to come into the sanctuary. And even then, all the good stuff happened behind those doors, in those rooms. The good stuff, meaning the sacrifice and the prayers and the sentences and the blessings that are offered on behalf of the people. And the males that were able to come and hear, kind of maybe peering around, trying to soak up a little bit of that grace from God. And the women who were still in the narthex are peeking in, hoping that maybe they might soak up a little bit of that grace, or hoping that their husband would soak up enough and bring it home for their whole family. Jesus' final week on earth was spent hanging out in these courts that surrounded the temple. The passages that were read from Luke, that Kendra read and that Annie talked about, and the cleansing of the temple, that all happened in the temple courts. And Jesus left us with some critiques of what was happening on these courts. And I hope this morning we will all try to figure out a little bit better what it means to make our courts God's courts. Because when it's full of other stuff, God's grace will not always flow as easily. And the basketball court is no different. Monday to Saturday is no different. Grace just doesn't flow very easily when you are full of other things. Take the basketball court where there's competitiveness, you're keeping score, emotions are running high, elbows are accidentally flowing, there's ambition, there's pride. And I've spent a lot of time on our basketball courts, even before I was hired to work here, and I've seen a lot of stuff happen. And I'm not as directly involved on those courts as I used to be, but with the AYMC, Mitty Taylor and Sean Martin and Caleb Avery are doing a great job making sure that a lot of God's work is happening on those courts and that it is open to everybody. But there's a cost to being welcoming like that. And like I said, I've seen a lot of stuff on our basketball courts, and the one I want to tell you about this morning really stands out. I think this was about 10 years ago, so before even the AYMC was built. I was playing in this game, just a game of pickup basketball, and some folks from the community had either walked or driven over, and they'd heard about a game of pickup basketball at that big church on the corner of Ferris and Cleveland where you could play for free, and a fight broke out. And there was one guy that was kind of responsible for it. It wasn't me. It was somebody in the game. I was playing in the game. And so I cleared the courts, kind of like Jesus clearing the temple. I cleared the courts. I said, everybody go home. We're through playing tonight. And I kicked that one guy out for good. I said, don't come back. And I've thought about that a lot. And as I've tried to be a part of making our courts God's courts, I've realized two things. First, that God's grace is needed for that. And two, that sometimes it is hard to be a vessel of that grace. In that final week before Jesus was crucified, Jesus left us some hints and some clear instructions on how this grace thing works. He actually did clear the temple courts, and to me that is a perfect model for emptying ourselves out so that God's grace can come in. I don't know the exact reason that Jesus cleared those courts. There are lots of competing theories, perhaps. There are animals running around, money changers who didn't have their people's best interests at heart. But whatever it was too much of our stuff for God's stuff to happen in that temple court, in that temple area. The Pharisee and the tax collector, two people who went up to the temple courts to pray, both were offered the same amount of grace, but one left justified and the other didn't. And the Pharisee, whose prayer sounded more like just a comparison to that poor wretch over there, was probably not a bad person, actually. And the tax collector, who offered a perfect prayer, was probably not a good person. He's probably a reviled person. But only one of those two people had made room for God's grace. and only one of those had accepted it. And the widow who gave those 2 copper coins, just a paltry fraction of what the other people were giving. When I think of her, I'm ashamed of the times I have wished that I would come into some money so that I could be generous. I've thought, boy, if I just had some disposable income, I could really, really be generous. She didn't have a great reason to be generous, not a logical reason, but she did have a good reason to be open to God's grace. And she let it spill out onto those courts, and Jesus saw it. And we are still benefiting from her grace. That happened that morning. When we do anything worthwhile for God's kingdom, it's because of God's grace, not because of anything that we are or we have done. Are we making room for God's grace in our lives? Are we inviting God's grace into our lives, and are we letting it spill out into the lives of others? I don't think I am, at least not enough. I am not naturally a vessel of God's grace. That's just not who I am. I've had to work on that. Here's a perfect example. In 9th grade, somehow I got moved into PE2. I think they needed to move some people around. So I ended up in a PE class with upperclassmen. And we didn't go through the traditional PE regimen. We basically just played basketball for 50 minutes. And I loved it. So I was watching all of these upperclassmen as I was trying to get to know them and playing basketball before I had to go take a history test. And all of a sudden, one of the guys that we were playing with, 11th or 12th grader, sprained his ankle or his knee or something, but he was howling in pain. And his friends rushed over to help him. And I wanted to see what they were going to do. I was just really curious. I didn't see any teachers around. I was just curious, how were they going to handle their friend in pain? And he didn't want to cry, but I think he was crying. It was so bad. And they went over to him, they kind of knelt down, and then there were 3 people that were helping him. One had his arm, and the other 2 had his legs, and they dragged him off the court, and they stepped over him, asked someone else to take his spot, and we kept playing. I kind of watched that with wonder. I remember thinking, okay, so that's what you do. I wouldn't say I was that bad, but that was kind of my model for people who really needed some care. Get them out of the way so that the game continues. That's who I was for a long time. I think I've changed while I've been here. I've had to kind of watch you. I've had to soak up some of your grace that you've been generous with. I've had to watch you take care of each other to see what it means to share God's grace with each other. And I would not even be here if it were not for grace. I've told this story a couple of times in private because it's so embarrassing, but I'm going to share it with you now, just to keep you interested at least. When I showed up to interview for the recreation coordinator 14 or 15 years ago, I walked in with a swollen black eye that I had received from a wayward elbow in a basketball game the night before. Despite that, the interview went okay, I guess. I think they were interested. I was definitely interested. And at the very end of the interview, I said something so ridiculous and embarrassing that I am lucky to be here. You know how you want to say, you can't decide whether you want to say this word or that word, so you kind of say the combination of the word and it's not the word you were looking for at all? Well, think about the words peek and look. If you put those together, what word do you get? Leak. So our interview happened right next to the old gym, and I could see into the old gym, so we ended, and I said, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to say, I want to take a peek in the gym or a look in the gym. And unfortunately, I didn't say either one of those. But let me just say again, it is because of God's grace and your grace and the grace of the search committee that I am here today. And the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector really didn't happen. It was actually a parable, if you noticed when Kendra was reading. Except it did happen, I'm sure, and it does happen over and over. The guy I was telling you about that I kicked out for fighting, and I said, don't come back here anymore. Well, he did come back, not to play basketball, but he wanted to talk to me. And when he came back, he could barely look me in the eye. I don't know if he did look me in the eye. He just kind of looked at the ground, his shoulders were slumped. That was a broken young man who had hit rock bottom, I guess, but he told me that that was in the past. He had prayed to God. That wasn't who he is going to be anymore. He didn't ask me for anything, he just wanted me to know. And as he left, I cringed. You know that feeling when something happens and you realize you were playing the part of the Pharisee? I really think I would have been a good Pharisee, by the way. Just born a couple thousand years too late. A decent person, a follower of rules, a real stickler. But that guy, I can just imagine my friends and I saying, at least we're not like that guy. At least we don't settle things on the court with our fists. He's a missionary now. If you just empty yourself, all of your stuff, God's grace will pour in. And I'm so grateful that it spilled over to me that day too. I think Jesus simply wanted to see that last week of his life on earth before he was crucified in those temple courts. I think he just wanted to see people open to God's grace. People making room for the goodness and steadfast love and faithfulness that are found in Psalm 100. Clearing the temple, making room for God's grace in your life so that God's stuff can happen. 2, the repentant tax collector. Knowing that you need God, making room for God in your life, and inviting God's grace. Not just once, but day after day, over and over. The widow, letting that grace spill out into the lives of others. And the cross, there is plenty more where that came from. Because in a couple of days, Jesus would empty himself to let God's grace in, to let it fill and spill out of him so that we could have a life of grace ourselves. Jesus didn't invent grace, but he made it a lot more accessible.